So welcome to the lesson on how to solder. And in this lesson we're going to just go through the basics. There are hundreds of videos on YouTube about soldering. Some are good, some are not so good. Very few of them are on the specific topic of soldering in FPV. So I thought it's a good idea just to give you a quick run through. Now, obviously, like I said, the first thing you'll need is a soldering iron. This one here is the TS100, comes under several different names on YouTube, but if you look up TS100, you'll come up with a number of different names sold by different Chinese suppliers. This one is highly recommended as it's portable, can be powered via a LiPo battery. Of course, it's up to you if you want to get a desktop station. I've had desktop stations before, hasn't been the greatest temperature control, that hasn't been that good. There are very good ones like the Hacker. I'll put a link in the shopping list to the ultimate soldering station if you want to splash out. But this guy here, the TS100, is widely known in FPV as a very good iron that is fairly well priced. It's got a very quick power up time. It's got very accurate temperature control, and temperature control is extremely important in soldering. Takes up less space on your workbench as well. This one here comes with a stock tip. I think this one is called the TS-B2. Very important to have a clean tip. Okay, before any soldering, you're going to use your wire wool to clean up your tip so that it's nice and shiny. It also comes with another tip called this one here is the TS-BC2. Obviously, the wider the area you have on the tip, the more dissipation of heat there is. So for larger jobs like soldering your pigtail to your ESC like this, you're going to require a bigger tip. This is probably not even big enough. You might need something like a chisel tip. A lot of people work with a chisel tip. Just look around at the different tips for the TS100 if you go for that. These are the two that I use. I use this one for the finer soldering joints with the finer wires to the flight controller, and the bigger tip I use for soldering pigtails to your ESC, and also soldering motor wires to your motor pads. So this here obviously is a flight controller. This is an older ESC that I've desoldered some. I've used this desoldering braided wick to desolder a couple of pads here. This joint here is actually a good example of a not so good joint because there's too much solder on there. These motor pads are soldered up nicely. You can see that the solder on there is nice and shiny. That's basically what you want. So to the basics again, you've got different types of soldering. The three main different types, as I say, are soldering your smaller wires to the flight controller. Then you've got your motor wires, which will go onto your ESC. And lastly, you've got your pigtails, which will go, I think this one is a 12 gauge. Some XT60s are soldered on with 14 gauge. I generally use 12 gauge, but bear in mind the thicker the wire, the more difficult it is to solder on nicely. Yeah, so you could use that 14 gauge for a pigtail to your ESC. So yeah, those are the three things: the small wires, the motor wires, and the pigtail. So those are the three main things you're going to need to know how to solder. So for soldering to the flight controller, these small wires here, you'll need a lower heat, something in the range of 350 degrees Celsius. For soldering motor wires, these slightly thicker wires, you might go up from 350 to something like 390 on your soldering iron. And to solder your pigtails, you probably use the maximum range on here, which is 400. And by the way, you can actually update the firmware on this iron. I'll provide links to that as well. It's got a little USB here, and you plug it into your computer, and you can update the firmware on this, and that'll give you a few different functions in addition to the ability to go up to 450. I think it is 450 degrees Celsius on this, which is quite nice. I generally get away with doing all my soldering at 400, but might be nice to go up to 450. Just bear in mind that the trick with soldering is basically to get in and out as quickly as possible, because too much heat on a pad can actually lift the pad off, and you've got a ruined board. So I know that sounds a bit scary, but we'll go through the basics. These pins here are pretty easy. You just use a fine tip, 350, something like that, a nice low heat. Always use your solder flux, okay, because that'll help with a nice joint. Again, like I said, always use leaded solder. You can, as I say, if you're worried about the leaded bit, just make sure that you've got a nice little desktop fan and some good ventilation. Also, bear in mind, another part of the preparation is to make sure that you've got good protection. So ventilation, eye protection. If you're wearing glasses, that's probably sufficient. If you don't wear glasses, just wear some protective eyewear, because I've actually had solder spit up at me in the past, and it does happen. So the last thing you want is a bit of solder, at 350 degrees or whatever, shooting into your eyeball. So to strip the wires, I generally use just a little hobby knife. You can get a wire stripper, again, up to you. That's that. You'll need your solder, 60/40 leaded solder. Need a flux pen, or you can use flux paste, but it comes in different varieties, but I find a flux pen, no clean flux pen, the best thing to use. I will provide some links to tutorials that I've seen in the past, mainly I think by Joshua Bardwell, the famous Joshua Bardwell. There's one in particular that I'd like you to have a look at. It's kind of the definitive go-to soldering tutorial. If you watch that, you'll learn absolutely everything that there is to know about soldering in FPV. This is really just to give you a basic introduction. So as we've said, we can desolder using our wick if you make a mistake, and we've talked about the different heats. So obviously lower heat for a smaller wire, medium heat for that, high heat for that. Always use your solder flux, as we'll demonstrate. I'll do a little demonstration in a minute. And yeah, let's get into it. So let's start off with wiring up one of our small wires, say from a camera or a VTX or a receiver wire. Later on we'll find out where on this flight controller we're going to solder it to, but let's just use any pad for the moment. Doesn't really matter. But one of the important things is when you're soldering to a flight controller, there are two ways of doing it. One is to actually poke the wire through the hole. Okay, you can see poking that wire through the hole and then soldering it that way. Another way is actually to actually just solder it onto the pad itself. that would probably be a little bit too long, that wire at the moment. You need it a bit shorter so that it only really covers that pad. And it's important to make sure that before you start soldering, you know, which direction are you coming in from? Are you going to solder from there? Are you going to go diagonally? So according to where your peripheral, your camera or your VTX is going to, just bear that in mind, how, you know, which direction you're actually going to solder to. So you can start off with a full length of wire, that doesn't matter, but eventually, you know, you're going to have to snip off the required amount to without having too much excess wire. Bear in mind that you generally twist the wires, especially for your camera and your VTX. So just have enough wire that's required to get to that peripheral or component part that you're soldering this to. So we'll power up our little iron here, and that'll power up to 350 by default. We don't need any more than that, and that's a good temperature to go for. I'm going to keep my fan off for the moment because it's going to probably make a little bit too much noise. Always, like I say, make sure that you've got a really nice, clean, shiny tip with no solder on to begin with, and that'll be good to go. So the first thing you're going to need to do is tin up your wire. This actually is pre-tinned, so you're going to, whatever you're soldering, you're going to apply a little bit of flux to the tin, the wire there. You're going to apply a little bit of flux to the pad as well that you're soldering to, and we can just apply a little bit of heat to that. Okay, and when you're soldering, take your solder wire, always put a little bit of solder on the tip. I think that's 350 now, that should be good to go, and I actually don't need much on here. Just literally just a tiny bit on that, okay, just so that that's tinned. Then if you're poking through the hole, the best thing to do is just to leave the pad as it is and poke the wire through the hole, so you've got just about enough there. Turn the thing round and apply a little bit of flux to your pad there. Should have probably done that actually before poking it through, just in case you poke the thing back out again. So like that. So yeah, generally we don't go outwards, we go inwards, because outwards means that it's going to be more susceptible to damage. Basically try and keep your wires faced in. So a little bit of solder there on the iron, and we're just going to solder that onto there like that. So you've got a nice shiny joint there. You can see that this smoke is basically the flux coming off, burning off, and that should in itself be pretty secure. You can, if you like, okay, so I'm giving that a good tug there. You could also apply a little bit of solder here on here, but because that's soldered on from the bottom nice and securely, that should be okay. The other way to do this is to, like I say, if you want to solder directly onto the pad, just make sure that you've tinned up your thingy here, your wire, and cut it to the correct length. So I'm going to just snip off a little bit here because that is too long. That's about right. Just going to tin that up. Again, this blue tack is fantastic for soldering. Make sure your tip is clean. Apply a little bit of solder to the tip, and that's all you need. Just get in there with a tiny bit of that. And in this case, we're going to solder from the top. Okay, let's just snip that off there so that it doesn't look as if we're soldering two joints together. So we're going to go, that one's going to go through, and this one is going to go on. So these are, I'm just demonstrating two different ways to do this. So let's go for another pad here. Let's take this pad in here, and it can get a bit tricky when you're doing you know, obviously two pads together, but yeah, just make sure that you don't get solder overlapping. So in this case, we're going to just heat up the pad a tiny bit, really tiny bit, apply a little bit of solder, get that solder on there, so you've got a nice shiny joint there. And I usually use a pair of tweezers to do this. And the most important thing is to line it up properly. So get yourself nicely lined up so that that is directly on there, and then clean up your solder tip again. Just a little bit of solder on there. Get in there nice and quick. So that's nice and tight, nice and shiny, and you've got your wire. So two ways of doing that.